Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are just waiting for a few more participants to come in, so please bear with us. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good evening to all participants. Thank you for joining us in this webinar on small-scale fishers and fish farmers restoring ecosystems, stories from Asia. My name is Susana Ciar, and I'm a Fishery and Aquaculture Officer at the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific in Bangkok. The study that will be presented today is an output under a letter of agreement between FAO and James Cook University. I am joined here by Dr. Simon Van Schmidt, FAO RAP Senior Fishery Officer, and colleagues from JCU, Dr. Naomi Gardiner, our speaker, and Drs. Shannon Keldson and Jan Stragnell of the Center for Sustainable Tropical Fisheries and Aquaculture. The study and this webinar contribute to the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture 2022, or IYAFA 2022 for short, which was launched on Friday last week. IYAFA 2022 aims to focus world attention on the role that small-scale fishers, fish farmers, and fish workers play in food security and nutrition, poverty eradication, and sustainable natural resource use, thereby increasing global understanding and action to support them. The study that will be presented during the webinar is a way of celebrating the contribution of small-scale fishers and fish farmers. The study also supports the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Asia is home to majority of the world's small-scale fishers and fish farmers whose livelihoods depend on the productivity of aquatic ecosystems. The degradation of productive aquatic ecosystems poses a threat to the sustainability of small-scale fisheries and aquaculture, the livelihoods of men and women in the fish value chain, and their food security and nutrition. As resource users with a responsibility for stewardship of the aquatic resources upon which they depend, small-scale fishers and fish farmers are in a position to contribute positively to restoration and sustainable use. This webinar is about solutions, methods, and approaches they are using to restore and protect the ecosystems on which their livelihoods depend upon. Let me now introduce our speaker. Dr. Naomi Gardiner is a research and teaching academic in marine science at James Cook University in Australia. Naomi has been directly involved with leading capacity building programs for environmental managers and researchers in the Asia-Pacific region. These have focused on a science for management approach that helps in-country researchers better target their work towards on-the-ground management applications and, conversely, connects managers and policymakers to the scientific community so that their work can take an evidence-based approach. Naomi and her colleagues work holistically across the biological, governance, and socioeconomic domains of tropical marine and aquatic ecosystems and human societies. This lens and a passion to help fisherfolk communities steward their ecological resources has enabled a balanced examination of the nexus between ecosystem restoration and small-scale fisheries and aquaculture. Before handing over the floor to Naomi, I would like to remind you about some house rules. Please post your questions at the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. You can also activate the live transcript on your screen. Just click the live transcript button to the right of the Q&A button to do this. This webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared to the participants. So I'm sure that everybody is excited to hear the findings of the study. So without further ado, over to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Susanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you today and share these stories. As Susanna has mentioned, this work is a contribution to the United Nations Decade of Ecosystem Restoration and to the 2022 International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture. Importantly, we seek to show how these two global initiatives are connected and how work to improve the sustainability of small-scale fisheries also leads to great advances in ecosystem restoration. The work today is specifically focused on the Asian context and particularly on South and Southeast Asia. The report from which this presentation is derived will be available in early 2022 from FAO and JCU. I'd like to start off by acknowledging the many small-scale fishers, fish farmers and fish workers whose work and livelihoods this presentation reflects upon. They are the true heroes of ecosystem restoration and those to whom I think more focus needs to be given. Secondly, the array of partners who have worked so well to empower and enable small-scale fishers to make changes. Today, I am working on the traditional land of the Australian Aboriginal peoples group, the Wulgurukaba people, and I live on the lands of the Bindal people. Here at James Cook University, we acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional owners of the land and waters where we work. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. In the spirit of reconciliation, we also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the global community. Artisanal fisheries and aquaculture in Asia dominates global seafood production and underpins much of the region's nutritional health, economy, and culture. Catch from small-scale fishers makes up about 40% of global fisheries production, and around half of that is from Asia. So that means artisanal fishers in Asia are thought to provide about 20% of total global fisheries catch. Additionally, 90% of global aquaculture product comes from Asia, much of which is from small-scale fish farms. Small-scale fisherfolk are typically poor, rural or remote, often landless, vulnerable and marginalised. A quarter of them live on less than $1 a day. Their fishing gear methods, the target species, the ecosystems they fish in are incredibly diverse. Their gear is typically simple and low cost, and many of their fishing areas are usually open access systems. Women make up about 40% of the small-scale fisheries sector, operating mostly in the value chain aspects, but they're also involved in business and farm management and directly in fishing operations. Catch is typically consumed by the fisher's family or within the local community, and this catch provides critical nutritional requirements for subsistence fisherfolk, particularly for women and children. The economy, the health, and the social well-being of Asia's small-scale fishers is totally dependent upon the productivity of the ecosystems they operate in. As you probably all know, marine and freshwater ecosystems all over the world are degraded, overexploited, polluted, and particularly so in Asia's waterways and oceans. Climate change impacts are going to further exacerbate these degraded states. So the current UN decade of ecosystem restoration seeks to draw attention and drive action on restoring ecosystem productivity. The primary aim is to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. In aquatic environments, ecosystem restoration is most well known from mangroves and coral reefs. For example, since 1966, mangrove restoration in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh has restored 195,000 hectares. Here, active restoration techniques are used to put out new seedlings, and remediation works are conducted to improve tidal flow and the health of these really important mangrove forests. Coral reef restoration in Indonesia, for example, has re-established functional reef habitat for up to 2 hectares from a really depauperate state. In the right location, coral fragments can grow very quickly, and in South Sulawesi reefs that had been basically destroyed by bomb fishing, these reefs have now got really high coral cover again. So restoring habitats at these very large scales is really important, but it's very challenging and it's very costly. And because of that, much of the work has been led by international development partners and national governments. Yet, to address declining ecosystem health, food security, and poverty alleviation, and the synergy of multiple sustainable development goals, it's really critical that the restoration of aquatic and marine ecosystems addresses the livelihood needs of Asia's artisanal fisherfolk. If and when the health of an aquatic system is restored to the point that it can sustain small-scale wild capture fisheries and host sustainable aquaculture enterprises, artisanal fisherfolk communities can fish, eat, build their economy, and escape poverty. But how does that happen, and who can do this work? So today I want to show you some examples of how small-scale fisher and aquaculture communities are restoring ecosystem productivity. The types of actions that fisherfolk do is inevitably directly related to improving their socio-economic condition in the near and long term. They need to catch fish to survive and sustain the fishery for their family's future. These are some of the activities that you will see repeated in the case studies that I show you today. Despite the enormous challenges, a change in the state of both ecosystems and in livelihoods is definitely possible. So the goals of this work that I'm presenting from today are to identify the types of activities small-scale fishers and fish farmers are doing to restore ecosystems and their impact on ecosystems and on their livelihoods. We want to explore the successes and challenges of fisher-led activities to restore ecosystems. By sharing these examples and retelling the fisherfolk community's own stories, the work seeks to enable more community-led restoration work that leverages on the success and the learnings of other initiatives. I will particularly highlight ways that women's livelihoods are being empowered through restoration initiatives. I'm going to cover examples from inland, coastal, and marine ecosystems from both wild capture and aquaculture production. The selection of case studies that I show you is by no means exhaustive, but does seek to showcase a spectrum of activities across aquatic ecosystem types, fisheries, and geographies. A few definitions and caveats to start with. Ecosystem restoration herein is defined as the process of assisting the recovery of a degraded, damaged, or destroyed ecosystem to reflect values regarded as inherent in the ecosystem and to provide goods and services that people value. This includes both active and passive restoration activities. Active restoration includes transplanting, planting or releasing seeds, and we can include restocking target fish species in this. Passive restoration removes or reduces the environmental stressor. For example, reducing fishing pressure, reducing marine pollution impacts. I will collectively refer to small-scale fishers and smallholder aquaculture farmers as fisherfolk. Fish is inclusive of finfish, invertebrates, and other aquatic organisms that are targeted by these fisheries. Lastly, while I will highlight the key partners and communities that have done the work, I'm not inferring that they have endorsed this particular study or its findings. So let's start off by having a look at inland fisheries. The wetlands of Asia. The floodplains and wetlands of Asia are extensive ecosystems and critically important fisheries. They host a quarter of the world's freshwater fish species, provide 2/3 of global inland fish catch, and make up 1/3 of the world's wetland areas. There are over 270 small native fish species from Asia freshwater systems. And rice cultivations in these wetlands is obviously critically important. Rice fish farming is an ancient practice. It's actually recognised as a globally important agricultural heritage. And in this practice, small native fish species are cultivated in the water channels around the rice fields. The fishery is highly efficient, not really needing additional feed or habitat, so long as water is able to flow through the wetlands in the flood seasons. The wetlands are usually an open access system, meaning that anyone can fish among the rice fields, water channels, and public reservoirs. Now that's really important for the most impoverished people, as these small native fish species are highly nutritious and because anyone can fish the waterways, so they have access to the fishery. Fish are usually caught and consumed by the immediate family or sold in local markets where it supplements income and nutrition from rice production. These diverse freshwater fish are dependent on the connectivity of wetlands and floodplains for breeding, dispersal, and growth. But the wetlands are very degraded, particularly due to hydrological changes, especially from dams and intensive irrigation. Pollution impacts are generally quite high from the use of agricultural chemicals in intensive farming and also from intensive aquaculture practices. Furthermore, climate impacts are increasing the frequency and intensity of droughts and flooding events. So how are artisanal fishers and farmholders helping rehabilitate these systems? In Laos, rice fish farmers in their villages are restoring the connectivity of waterways by constructing fishways. This is an image from Pak Pyong wetland and shows the design of concrete structures in a water channel in front of the outflow from a dam wall. This fishway helps fish move safely between the rice channels and the Mekong River once again, instead of being blocked by a dam wall. The fishway was co-designed and built by the local community in a collaboration with Lao and Australian governments and researchers. The fisher community also decided they wanted to put in a no-take reserve area that would protect the migrating and the breeding fish from being fished. The community is enforcing their regulations and they're also measuring the results of the project by looking at the fish assemblage and how it's responding. In Cambodia, 30% of fish production comes from rice field systems, and Cambodia actually hosts the 5th largest inland fishery in Asia. Here, artisanal fishing villages are setting aside community fish refugia, or CFRs. These are perennial deep water bodies that don't usually dry out in the dry seasons, and they're home to native fish, crustacean plants, and other aquatic organisms. The water body affords aquatic animals a place to survive, breed, and grow. And when the flood season starts, the fish are able to disperse throughout the floodplains before receding back into these deep water bodies again in the late dry season. So artisanal communities design a CFR system that's suitable for their context. They implement fishing regulations like banning fishing in the refugia. They do surveillance. They're improving the hydrology of the floodplains and channels so that ponds are better connected to each other. And small native fish species can move freely in and out of the CFR water body and the nearby channels as the floods recede. Community committees organise activities like weed removal and revegetation. They manage community funds and they share information with the rest of the community, conduct monitoring, and in some cases also restock native fish. There's so many positive outcomes from these activities, both for the environment and the community's well-being. We see increased fish catch, higher biodiversity, such as fish species reappearing that had not been seen in the local waterways for many years. In the Cambodian systems, up to 135 species have actually been counted in these areas. So the local genetic diversity of fish and other aquatic organisms is being conserved. Income from fish catch and sales has increased up to 10-fold in some cases, and there's great nutritional benefits with 13% more small fish being eaten. And that's really important because of their very high micronutrient load. There's overall gains in resource equity among the villagers. More people have consistent access to water and to fish resources. This is really important in the longer drought periods that some countries have experienced, and really important for fishers who don't have any land or rice access. Having fish in these rice fields also naturally increases the productivity of the rice field. The rice grows better, and water quality is improved through reduced reliance and use of chemicals. In addition to improved ecosystem connectivity, the collective actions of fish farmers have empowered their own agency, the community's cohesion, and also connected them with external partners. These things alone increase the community's level of resilience to climate and pandemic shocks. Following their successes and the benefits that they've seen, the communities are now actively sharing their knowledge, learnings, and skills with neighbouring communities and indeed other countries. For example, the fishways modelled from the initial fishway program in Laos are being installed already or on the way at 40 other sites, and the village has become a demonstration site for national and international visitors. In Cambodia, the CFR model is also being scaled up to other rice fish wetland areas. Another related system in these rice fisheries is integrated aquaculture. So many rural families have home ponds, and aquaculture practices in these ponds and also in the community reservoirs is being improved through polyculture or integrated aquaculture practices. Here, ponds are being improved so that you can grow rice, vegetables, and fish at the same time. The fish waste fertilizes the waters naturally and reduces the need for chemical products, while the vegetation provides structure, filters the water, provides prey for fish. Broodstock hatcheries have also been set up with assistance from development partners like WorldFish and funded by USAID. These are enabling local aquaculture farmers, especially women, to produce native fish stock and on-sell this stock to the community. Successful women are championing the approaches within their communities and sharing their knowledge on environmentally friendly hatchery techniques with other women, empowering more people to adopt sustainable techniques. So the hatcheries provide a really important source of native seed for restocking local reservoirs and home ponds, rather than and reduce the reliance on introduced or invasive species. So local genetic diversity is being conserved and enhanced through these systems, pollution is being reduced, and farmers are improving the vegetation and hydrology through channel works particularly. And again, the community's agency, their awareness and their involvement in restoring healthy waterways is improved. This is a nice catch of the Hilsa fish. The Hilsa is a type of shad. It migrates from the coast far up into the inland waters of Bangladesh, Myanmar, and India. It's the national fishery of Bangladesh, and it's highly iconic. It's caught by inland and marine fishers with about a 50-50 ratio. The estimated product value of the Hilsa fishery is about $4 billion per annum. And there's around 3 million fishers or fish workers employed in the fishery, most of them are small-scale fisherfolk. By the late 1990s, however, the stocks were seriously depleted, and this led to the Bangladesh government and WorldFish-led projects to rebuild the fishery. The primary fishery management tool here has been the creation of 6 sanctuaries along the fishers' migration route up the river. These are intended to protect juveniles and the brooding stock in the spawning season. Also, destructive fishing gear has been banned and further effort restrictions have been imposed along this migration route. Incentives have been provided to the fishers most affected by these closures in the form of rice packages. So this management has been somewhat successful and had already led to a 5% increase in production per annum. Since 2014, the Bangladesh government and World Fish have been jointly implementing another project called EcoFish. This seeks to establish a collaborative, science-based, adaptive co-management for the fishery, involving all of the stakeholders. It builds on the previous management successes, but it really seeks to go bottom up with a focus on fisher livelihoods. I really wanted to highlight here the partnership with women fisherfolk and the impact that women are having on restoring the Hilsa fishery system. So women-only community savings groups have been established here in 136 villages along the river system. The women also have leadership roles in the village-wide committees for the fishery. In these groups, the women are gaining really critical skills and training in financial management, among other things. The economic and the leadership gains that the women have found has led them to really championing the cause of fishery conservation. The women are actively sharing their stories with one another and influencing the male fishers to comply with regulation, both male fishers from within their household and within the wider community. So some of the outcomes from this co-management system and the women's actions so far have been a 25% average increase in household income. Hilsa catch has gone up by another 11%. The size of individual fish on average is up by 40%. Diversity and abundance of other species in the river has also increased, and the equity and the agency of the women in resource conservation and management is greatly expanding. As I mentioned in the beginning, ecosystem restoration is most well known from mangrove systems. South and Southeast Asia host a large proportion of the world's mangroves and the highest diversity, but these forests are very degraded. A third of mangrove loss globally is due to clearing for intensive shrimp ponds. And much of this has ended in disaster from disease outbreaks among the shrimp. Many shrimp ponds are still abandoned in Southeast Asia. Now, mangrove restoration is well known, but for the most part, it's been top down in its approach. And that's led to negative impacts on artisanal fishers and farmer livelihoods, their resource access and their food security. Thankfully, co-management approaches are increasing now. And through these models, fisherfolk communities are being enabled to benefit from restoration programs and actually start to lead the endeavours. Silver aquaculture is one such example. In the Mekong Delta, 50% of Vietnam's mangroves is in Khao Mau, and it includes a Ramsar-listed national park. Mangrove forests were heavily deforested in the Vietnam War and then suffered extensive clearing for farming and aquaculture. To address this, the Vietnamese government law now mandates that a minimum of 70% of mangrove cover in shrimp production areas is maintained. Smallholder farmers are using an extensive pond model where large ponds are stocked with shrimp, and existing mangrove stands within and around the ponds is maintained or even extended where necessary to improve the forest canopy cover. These ponds are much larger than your typical shrimp pond. Farming shrimp within these mangrove forests reduces the chemical reliance and the feeding requirements. There's less stock put into the ponds, but the quality of the catch is higher. Water quality is also improved. The shrimp are less prone to disease outbreaks as well. So for example, when white spot disease decimated intensive shrimp farm cultures in 2012, mangrove shrimp farms remained viable and profitable. Some farmers are also taking up organic practices. These extend on the things I've covered already, but there is more active mangrove planting. Farmers maintain clean waste and farm facilities, and there's organic chemical usage is completely removed. Aquaculture waste is also further removed. Now in this province, there's some 5,000 hectares that has been certified as organic, and that's produced by over 1,200 households. The farmer cooperatives here enable market access and access for the farmers to critical training programs such as how to do mangrove shrimp farming. Besides the environmental outcomes that I've mentioned, livelihood benefits include increased income by up to 40% and increased awareness and agency about the environment, the products and sustainable farming methods. The smallholder farmers and their cooperatives are now in extended multi-stakeholder partnerships with the greater market, indeed the global market, and also with management and government agencies. The farmers also have access to microcredit loans, and they collectively collaborate in farming, harvest training, and do things to help each other out. So this makes for a stronger and more resilient community. Let's have a switch now to the marine realm, which makes up quite the extent of Asia's fisheries and small-scale fisheries community. Our first story here is about restoring pelagic productivity. In the Maluku Islands of Indonesia, small-scale tuna fishers from Buru Regency have returned to a highly selective traditional fishing methods, so as to improve the sustainability of their fishery and help restore productivity. This has actually resulted in them being the first artisanal fishers in the world to attain fair trade certification, and more recently to undergo assessment by the Marine Stewardship Council. It started out with the initiative of a locally based NGO group, MDPI. They helped fishers form cooperative committees and engaged these fishers with the sustainable global supply chain markets. So the fishing community collectively agreed to stop purse seining and destructive fishing, such as bomb fishing, that was destroying their fringing reef structures. And they switched to using handline or traditional kite fishing methods with a one hook, one fish policy. This method ensures that there's no bycatch and that undersized or non-target fish can be released alive. Landing prices were set with the sustainable supply chain partners, and a community fund was set up to share profits with the whole community via improving infrastructure and the like. These fisher communities are remote, they're poor, generally really poor landing facilities and very limited building and waste infrastructure. Through the changes that the community has made, the whole economic state of their villages has increased. Homes, schools, town facilities have been improved because of the community funds that they've got available. Marine debris cleanup takes place by the community. Turtle nesting sites are being protected and rehabilitated as well. The fishers no longer throw out rubbish while they're fishing, and a very strong sense of agency for sustainable fishing and environmental stewardship exists. The cooperative members also monitor their fisheries catches. Fisherfolk are learning business management and leadership skills and the technical skills that are needed for the supply chain interactions. Importantly, their safety at sea has also been improved through access to training and equipment. The success has been scaled out to other small-scale tuna fishers in Indonesia and also around the world. In Indonesia, there's now over 800 fishers engaged and 32 fisher associations. Through the pandemic, the fishers and their partners have also found innovative ways to keep progressing with their efforts and even help transform global traceability initiatives by direct online connections between fishers and the certification teams. Now to seagrass restoration. The Seto Inland Sea in Japan is a temperate system dominated by seagrass beds. Coastal development, pollution, and overfishing had reduced extensive seagrass from 590 hectares to just 12 hectares by the 1980s. Noting the decline of this seagrass and its apparent effect on their catch, 19 traditional pound net fishers got together and started collecting seeds and replanting the seagrass beds in the 1980s. They relied upon their traditional knowledge of the system to plant out the seeds and re-established about half of the beds. The Hanasi Fishery Cooperative Association, which is the collective fishery operator group in the area, got behind the pound net fishers' actions in the early 2000s and joined them in replanting efforts. Collectively, these actions were successful in re-establishing the functional recovery of the seagrass beds. Traditional user rights have also been recognised by the national and state level governments, and community restorations were picked up by media. Community restoration efforts were picked up by the media, by conservation NGOs and tourism companies. Youth have also become engaged, and the Fisherfolk's social network has greatly expanded. Some of the outcomes of the fisher actions were that they restored over 450 hectares of the seagrass. And these seagrass beds are now self-sustaining. There's ecological spillover with genetic connectivity, and the biophysical function of the beds has been restored. By all accounts, they're very healthy seagrass beds. There's also been some increase in the fish biomass and the diversity, but it really depends where you are in the seagrass bed because of seagrass ecology. Water quality is increased because the pollution was reduced, and also just because the seagrass beds are healthy. The water quality there is now so good that oyster fisheries are the dominant fishery there. There's been variable economic gains for the pound net fishers that started this off, but there's been a lot of broader socio-economic gains. Importantly, the whole community's economy is now quite diverse. The community's agency and pride has really lifted, and this alone is addressing ageing demographic challenges because now younger people are getting involved in the fishery. There's increasing local tourism, and the social heritage of the pound net fishery and other fisheries there have been preserved. Coastal fisher communities across Asia are increasingly engaged in blue swimmer crab fisheries. Like other fisheries, though, there's been lots of overharvesting and stock collapse. Communities in Thailand, Cambodia, and Malaysia are improving their local stock levels by implementing crab banks, no-take zones, minimum size regulations, and bans on the harvest of gravid or buried females. Using a crab bank system, gravid female crabs are protected from fishing until after they've spawned. The communities do this by either marking the crabs, putting them in cages or mariculture pens, and some communities put them in land-based aquaculture systems. The type of system that they use, that the community uses, depends on the local socioeconomic and environmental contexts. Communities have formed fisher associations that make cooperative decisions on the crab bank system, the type of fishing gear that's allowed, where any reserves are located, what the minimum size of crab is that one's allowed to catch, and what members get from being involved in the cooperative. Generally, by participating, members get a proportion of the reserved females to sell, and another set proportion is released into the no-take areas after the crabs have spawned. This provides economic benefits while also reserving the stock for the next year's catch. Members work together to enforce protected areas, they resolve conflicts together, and they provide economic support to each other. Successful crab bank cooperatives have increased the crab catch rates, the size of the crabs, and they've also protected seagrass, mangrove, and coral reef areas from non-selective and damaging fishing techniques. Communities are also self-monitoring their stock levels and the condition of their fishery. Socially, these fisher communities are now more cohesive, and they've got a greater awareness of marine resource challenges and a greater agency, that is responsibility, in the fishery. They're also connected to larger sustainable fisheries research, trade, and governance networks. Marine protected areas. Marine park systems are a great tool for conserving and rehabilitating ecosystem health. And when their design and implementation is sufficiently led by local fisher communities, they can achieve great socioeconomic outcomes for fisherfolk. Here, I will give some examples of several community-led marine park programs that are having success in restoring fisheries productivity, marine ecosystem health, and in turn, socioeconomic benefits for fisherfolk. Firstly, in East Timor, in partnership with World Fish, Blue Ventures, and USAID funding and the national government, a number of communities have instated customary management regulations. These are called taru bandu, but the type of system that's involved differs a bit among the villages depending on what that village wants to implement. In Bahau, the fisher community has designated an MPA system that includes fishing gear restrictions, no-take areas, access and anchorage limitations, and a multi-purpose use zone. The community has installed buoys to demarcate protected zones, and a female-led fisheries monitoring group has started up. In Adara, on Atarua Island, women have also been collecting socioeconomic data on local fisheries catches. This informs the community's marine management program and its progress. The Adara community have really been the leaders in community-based protected area management in East Timor. They've set up a no-take area, banned destructive fishing, developed tourism ventures, and realised economic gains through doing so. The fringing reef area that they live by has remained healthy and supports a high biodiversity. The no-take area that they have reduces fishing pressure on the reef, has near-shore fish aggregating devices that give the community a way to get pelagic fish. A community fund, which is derived from the fishing and tourism income, has also been set up and is used to improve the community's infrastructure. Karimunjawa National Park in Indonesia was set up in 1986. It's one of Indonesia's most well-known and oldest national park areas. It's run by the central government with a lot of help from international conservation partners. In 2003, the top-down management started to shift towards a co-management model, wherein Fisherfolk can realise gains from their involvement in park management. Here, fishers have stopped destructive fishing. They help monitor compliance. They're now using more selective fishing gears like spear guns to reduce bycatch, and they've agreed to spatial and temporal restrictions on vulnerable fish species such as gropers. The fishers get involved in spatial planning decisions for designation of traditional fishing areas and also in the development of new fisheries ventures. The impact of the fishers' involvement has been such that when the area was hit by mass global coral bleaching in 2006, the reefs here actually bounced back quite well. Changing the fishing practices meant that the reef structure has improved, and coral cover and diversity has increased over time. Compliance by the fisherfolk with zoning regulations has also increased, and fisherfolk rights are better recognised in government policies now. The economic gain and the opportunities for small-scale fishers has also increased slowly. The fisherfolk have access to training and income through mariculture in addition to tourism incomes. Myanmar's marine fisheries are heavily overexploited. Only 10% of the estimated 1980 pelagic stocks now remain, and only half of the demersal stocks are thought to remain. Recently, participatory approaches and spatial planning activities are enabling fisherfolk communities to have a voice in designing and implementing co-management. Early indicators of the locally led impact are that there's increased compliance with zoning regulations and increased local activity in monitoring this compliance. There's also anecdotal evidence that fishery capture's improved and illegal fishing has declined. Turtle conservation by the fisherfolk is particularly active, and this has continued throughout the pandemic. If you have a look at their Facebook page, you will often see examples of turtle conservation, and here they're moving vulnerable turtle eggs to different locations. Particularly exciting, though, are the ventures by She Investments. Here, women fisherfolk, who are traders usually, are learning financial management, entrepreneurial skills, and getting access to microcredit. This is empowering the women's confidence, their self-worth, and enabling them to sustain their families. The women are then championing environmental stewardship and sharing their knowledge about marine resources and encouraging more sustainable fisheries and supply chain measures, like using biodegradable packaging. The word has got out about the success of co-management and participatory planning programs in this area, such that more communities are wanting to get involved in developing effective local resource management plans. In the late 1990s, coral reefs on Bali's northwest coast were severely degraded. Or by the 1990s they were. The reefs had been destroyed by bomb fishing, cyanide poisoning, and other destructive fishing techniques. Ornamental fish catch for the aquarium trade had declined and fisher livelihoods were quite poor. A local NGO group, who at first pretended to be an export agent, showed fishers how to use small barrier nets instead of cyanide and talked to them about the impacts of destructive fishing environmentally and economically. The fishers were aware that their reef was in very poor condition and getting worse, but they weren't necessarily aware that the things they were doing were causing a lot of that impact. When they heard about the issues and were shown a different way to fish, two of the fishers enthusiastically took the lessons on board and have gradually influenced all the fishers in the village to change their ways. The fisher community then formed a collective agency, stopped destructive fishing, and took up sustainable techniques. Their practice and their knowledge was widely shared, and later the community has engaged in reef rebuilding and active reef restoration techniques. 30 years on, and Les Village's environmental and economic state has been transformed. Coral and reef fish at Les Village has respectively increased by 45 and 70% of what it seemed like they were like in 1986, and that was from a very depauperate and dysfunctional state. Les Village is now a well-known ecotourism destination with a diversified income base. Sustainable ornamental fishing still occurs, and the village is actually home to a research and development agency for aquaculture of ornamental fish. The villages and this agency train other communities throughout Asia in sustainable ornamental fisheries, and they also contribute to global supply chain management through the IMAC Council. So I think you will have seen that there's a number of activities led by the Fisherfolk communities that are quite similar across ecosystems, geographies, and cultures. There's passive restoration activities that reduce pressure and destructive ecosystem effects of fishing. These they might reduce or eliminate the destructive fishing, such as banning the practices and switching to more selective gear types that protect juveniles and non-target species. There's also reduced fishing effort through spatial closures or temporal closures. Active restoration activities include improvements to hydrological connectivity of the floodplains, of reserve areas, and of tidal areas that re-enable fish migration. There's examples of where stock have been enhanced, habitats being rebuilt, species have been replanted. And hatchery production of native species and the release of non-invasive resilient species is also another active restoration technique. Environmental impacts have also been reduced or mitigated by reduced production of supply chain waste, be it from aquaculture, but also from coastal pollution and reducing erosion. And there's improved infrastructure and waste management, such as sewage, in a lot of these communities, which has been enabled through the fisher cooperatives and their community funds. Fisherfolk have also got involved in protecting endangered, threatened, and protected species, such as turtles, where they're guarding nests and monitoring the populations. This is typically an additional action taken up by the community following their increased agency in resource management. Emerging programs are also enabling fishers to monitor their own success and manage their own fishery resources and the benefits they gain. And as you've heard, there's a variety of positive impacts from fisher-led activities. Environmentally, we see increased abundance and biomass of targeted stock. There's changes in the size distributions with more larger fish coming through, and increased biodiversity because bycatch and destructive fishing is reduced. Water quality is improved, biophysical function of the ecosystem is improved, and there's restored connectivity of the stock through fish migrations or spillovers from reserve areas. Notable livelihood impacts include increased food security and nutritional benefits. There's direct economic benefit from sales and reduced expenses for aquaculture farmers. There's increased women's leadership and empowerment. And there's greater partnerships between the small-scale fisher communities and the supply chain businesses, government agencies, research agencies, and international development partners. Communities themselves have become more consultative with each other and more cohesive. There's training that has enabled fisher folks to better manage their resources in a co-management approach, grow their businesses, and also to use conflict management tools, which are really important. There's more effective governance and recognition of local user rights by the higher government bodies. And fishers in these case studies are getting a voice at the provincial and national government tables. Some of the common enablers that can kickstart action or enable some scaling up involve the creation or activation of fisher cooperatives or community groups, identifying local leaders and developing their knowledge and giving them the resources so that they can champion the action and grow the actions. Enabling direct economic benefits are absolutely critical. And participatory approaches and deep consultation with communities that identifies their needs and has authentic relationships with the communities is really important. There's a good way to scale up is by building a community's collective culture or leveraging on those communities that already have a strong collective culture. By providing communities with tools that enable self-management, conflict resolution, and financial development, there's a lot of progress being made. Community-led surveillance and enforcement actions that's integrated with government processes is quite important. Government recognition of the fisherfolk's management decisions and a collaborative partnership between the fisherfolk and the government at different levels is really important, albeit challenging. Lastly, empowering women to lead, self-manage and steward their community's resources is leading to some quicker environmental gains than has been seen in the past. Now, I haven't really said much about challenges, but they're certainly there. Success does not happen quickly, and in many situations, there hasn't been success at all. None of these challenges are easy to fix, and all of them are linked to each other. Environmental challenges include poor site selection, poor species selection, insufficient connectivity of the system, ongoing destructive fishing practices, probably coupled with weak enforcement, and areas where pollution hasn't been sufficiently addressed, leading to poor water quality, high effluent loads, erosion, and the like. Where there is limited economic gain, fisher community action is not sustained beyond project tenures. Failure also often arises from insufficient community consultation or involvement that doesn't adequately ascertain what the community's needs are, address equity issues, and gain trust that enables the community's actions. Similarly, top-down approaches. Some countries' ecosystem restoration programs are still heavily top-down, such that it's not yet apparent what fisherfolk restoration actions are happening, if at all. Weak community cohesion is especially limiting, especially where conflict among resource users is not managed early on, or the communities don't have the tools to manage such conflict. There's also challenges, and a lot of challenges, around market issues and weak supply chains. So it might be because there's limited product demand, or there's weak industry links with the fishers, or there's supply chain inefficiencies that limit the return for fishers from being involved. Severe weather events from climate change hamper progress at best, and at worst completely destroy the environmental success that communities have had. But as we've seen, these things can be addressed and overcome. Enabling fisherfolk communities with the means to improve their livelihoods and the sustainability of their fishery builds the resilience of both the community and the ecosystem. In conclusion, small-scale fishers and fish farmers are actively restoring aquatic ecosystems. Their efforts are reverting degraded, unproductive ecosystems back into functional and connected states that can provide nutrition, income, and physical security for people. Success is possible over the long term, but it requires authentic, people-first partnerships and co-management. Programs are needed that enable fishers to lead their own sustainable economic and environmental development. The small-scale fisher and fish farmer communities in Asia are characteristically innovative and adaptive. With the help of authentic and long-term partnerships, they're empowered to take the lead in restoring the productivity of the aquatic ecosystems that their lives and cultures depend upon. I'd like to again acknowledge the amazing fisherfolk and fish farmer communities and their partners that are doing this work, and this is really their stories. I'd also like to acknowledge some colleagues that have really helped in terms of chatting through these issues and highlighting particular case studies. And I'd like to thank Susanna, particularly from the FAO Regional Office of the Asia Pacific. There's lots of references, so stay tuned for the forthcoming report that will be out and released in early 2022. And I'd really welcome your questions, your comments and suggestions. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Dr. Jan Strugnell to facilitate the question period.
Hi everyone, thanks so much, Naomi, for a great seminar. we really encourage you to put some questions in the Q&A. So if you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, just to the right of the middle point is the Q&A. And if you type your questions in there, we'll get them to Naomi. So Naomi, one question's come in already. And the question is, grown together rice and fish called Mina paddy in Indonesia, and silvo fishery, which is the growth of shrimps and crabs inside mangrove areas, are known but not yet popular in Indonesia. Are there some barriers for these sustainable fisheries methods? And I believe that Simon might also comment on this in addition to yourself, if you'd like to speak to that, Naomi.
Thank you. And thank you to the person that's asked that great question. So this kind of method it's a really exciting venture, and it can really lead to some great environmental and socio-economic benefits, as we've seen in other areas of Asia. There are barriers to all of the studies that I've presented and the types of systems that are in place. And those barriers will really depend upon the context of the particular country, its type of governance, but also the context of the particular communities, what kind of fish farming systems they have already. It will depend on the availability of particular stock. But yeah, I think that it's important to explore how these programs can be instated and get going in more communities so that there is more sustainable aquaculture and rice fish farming happening there. Do you want to comment, Simon?
Sure, thank you very much. Yeah, just to follow up on that, all of these systems can deliver environmental benefits and can help to rehabilitate or restore either freshwater environments or mangrove type environments. There are some caveats on that, however. One of the issues, particularly with crab culture, is that it can drive exploitation of juveniles to stock, and that can actually lead to overfishing on your crabs, particularly if immature crabs are being taken and fattened and then sold on. So it's not perfect, but if it's handled properly, they can have a positive effect on the environment. All of these systems of integration also tend to be fairly extensive, and this leads to one other issue, which is that controlling what you're doing and having agreements with the people around you that these stocks are owned and that they're not part of the open access fishery and no one can just wander in and catch them is an important part of it. So this kind of compliance and social buy-in and having people on board with it, that community cohesion aspect is really important. I think that was coming through a lot of the case studies that we saw. Thanks.
Yeah,
Amy.
indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question here. And it says, thank you for the mention of the crab bank in Thailand. It's a famous and successful activity in the local communities for conservation and sustaining crab resources. But there are some problems about the payment of electricity. Therefore, some crab banks have tried to apply by using solar cells. Do you have some suggestions?
Thank you. That's really interesting. I don't know enough about the in-depth detail of these crab bank fisheries, but if you've got suggestions, by all means, do email me so we can talk more about that. But I've covered a lot of different case studies, and unfortunately there's not the depth to go into more of them, to go into much depth with all of them, but just to kind of draw together different similarities and challenges across them. But Simon, do you know anything more about that?
Yeah, I can maybe comment on it. The issue is a little bit like whether you pay gradually for an electricity bill month by month, or whether you have an upfront payment when you develop the crab bank and set up a solar array with batteries. The main things that you need for crab banking with the onshore tanks are aerators, small aerators like aquarium aerators, and small pumps just to exchange water. So it's not a huge aspect, but obviously the bigger the crab bank, the more electricity you'll use, and the more solar equipment you would need to install. And that can end up being quite a big capital cost. So although it doesn't cost you to run, you still need that investment up front. So finding that money up front is going to be an issue. But thanks for the question.
Yeah, it also highlights which I just don't have time to go into, that there's a great need for investment in community approaches, including the crab banks and the mangrove shrimp culture stuff. And where development agencies, governments, international funding bodies can target this funding, there's great opportunity to scale up and to scale out from some of the ventures like the successful Thailand crab bank system that's already there.
Thank you. So we have another question here that says, so in this review, Naomi, were you able to get a feel for how often local community organisations were empowered to a point where they could attract resources, even international, and lead future initiatives with INGOs stepping out of the way? If not, where are the INGOs going wrong?
I think there's lots of opportunities, and the key thing is that it's a partnership. None of these communities are doing it on their own. And once they get started, they don't do it on their own. They do it with the partnerships that they've developed. So NGOs are still staying involved. And I really like the example from Maluku, from Indonesia, with the tuna fisheries. So this started out with a collaboration between a small local NGO and the fisher community there, who helped the fishers get together. That partnership's been going for a while now, and it's really expanded and scaled out. So the initial MDPI, the initial NGO, is very much still involved, but now there's a lot of other NGOs and supply chain businesses and government agencies that are also involved. So partnerships start and they continue. The initial funding from, say, a 3 or a 5 year project term might finish, but if that partnership is set up well in the first place, particularly through participatory approaches that really learn what the community needs and what could be scaled, what are the challenges ahead, you can really set up a foundation for great partnerships that keep going into the future. So I hope that addresses the question. I think it's about setting up longer term partnerships that are really important. Partners stay involved, and that's really important. If anything, the partnerships get greater and become more diverse as the community gets more contact, say, with private businesses, with private supply chains, and international government linkages.
Thanks, Naomi. Another question here asks, as someone whose work is on project development, I'd be interested to know, is there any assessment estimate on how much money would be required for restoration of, let's say, at least 50% of the community managed fisheries in the Asia Pacific, and what might be the returns on this investment?
I'll confess that one's well out of my depth. I'm sorry, I don't know. We need an economist of sort, I think, to answer that question, but it's really important and something that needs to be addressed to really inform, international development. Simon, have you got any suggestions on that?
I don't have a suggestion, and since the question was for my colleague, I'll take it up with him later.
Thank you.
The issue, and this is a really, really big issue for us. I engaged in a study about 2 years ago where we tried to get an economics think tank to try to develop the economic argument for restoring wetlands, specifically wetlands. And after about a year of work, they were only able to conclude that they couldn't do it because everyone values stuff differently, and the standardization of the approaches, the way people apply these values, the studies that are out there in the world are very, very mixed, and it really prevents us getting that nice, neat number. So this is really one of those big research questions or big questions that's still out there. Can we try to get a value on these intangible benefits or less tangible economic benefits from community fisheries and restoration of those communities? A lot of it's going to be improved livelihoods. A lot of it's going to have secondary economic benefits. It's not going to just be a big dollar value in terms of the economy. We don't have that yet. And we also, still don't really have good quantitative data about the kind of improvements economically that occur with the rehabilitation and restoration of community fisheries. We know that livelihoods improve. We know that some fish catches may get better, but there's a lot of other things that occur that are not really economic benefits, but overall benefit the community. Trying to stick a dollar value on that is tricky. And certainly, you know, from a hard fisheries economy perspective, might not still be a very impressive figure.
Thanks, Simon and Naomi. I've got another question about climate change. So what type of solutions can we do to help the artisanal fisheries if climate change continues to persist, especially those artisanal fishers that live along the coastal waters, because they're highly dependent on the climate to be able to go to sea? Yeah, we're hoping you can share your opinion about that, Naomi.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think the most important thing that we can do, and governments and partners can do in helping artisanal fishers in this way, is by helping those artisanal fishers improve their livelihoods and the state of the ecosystem that they're operating within right now. We need to build up the resilience of the ecosystems, be it mangroves or the coral reef. We need to build the health of that system back up again, so that there's some capacity in the ecosystem itself to be able to withstand increased pressure from climate change. So we see that a lot in coral reefs. If a coral reef is healthier and stronger, then it's able to bounce back from some bleaching events much better. Now, sustained impacts, say multiple coral bleaching events, back-to-back events in a few years, as we've had here on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, can be really devastating. And so there's some impacts from climate change that it's almost impossible that we can restore that ecosystem enough in a quick time frame. But we can do things, and it's really important to improve and help the fisher communities improve the health, the function, the structure of their particular ecosystem, their coastal or their reef system or their wetland area, so that that system is actually got a much higher natural resilience per se to be able to cope with climate change. And most of the case studies that I've shown today also show that when the community is involved deeply in improving their own fishery productivity, and particularly through fisher associations, they can get more cohesive and the community becomes more collective. They help each other out a lot more. And this also builds the community's resilience at the same time as building up that ecosystem resilience. So I hope that answers the question. There's definitely change that we can do as partners with the communities. And it's really important to focus on rebuilding the health of these ecological systems that are there right now, and helping the communities do that so that it can withstand some of the climate impacts a lot better.
Thanks, Naomi. So another question here about the crab bank activity that you mentioned, especially in Thailand. Most of the fisher folk in the villages have engaged in this activity, but in some areas this has been stopped because of the monsoon activity between November and April each year. And the question is, do you have an idea on how to make this group of fishers to be able to continue ecosystem restoration activity during the monsoon season in Thailand?
Yeah, so that is true, and I just didn't have time to get into the depths of that. So during the monsoon season, fishers can't fish per se. So the community funds that are set up are really important here, and the community's collective engagement in the crab bank fisher cooperative. In this, and it's that cooperative that can help the community sustain their income and particular things that they're redoing to improve their livelihoods and also improve the state of the ecosystem. So being involved in that crab bank cooperative itself, and where those cooperatives are working really well, and there's community funds that are collectively used in a transparent and a good way of sharing resources among the members, then the fishers are able to sustain their livelihoods and also sustain their efforts, so that after the wet season, the crab bait fishery can continue. During the wet season itself, look, it might not be that there is particular ecosystem activities that can continue in terms of active restoration, but there'd be plenty of opportunity in that downtime for training to be done, capacity building, for knowledge to be shared, for sort of social activities among the community that really sets them up well for the next season when that comes along.
Thanks, Naomi. We have no further questions in the chat. If you have a question for Naomi, I'll give you a few moments to pop that in the chat now. So if you haven't seen the button, it's at the bottom, move your mouse to the very bottom of the screen, just to the right of the center line. I see that one person has their hand up, but I'll ask you if you can put your question in the chat, if that's possible. Okay, Naomi, I think we might leave it there if there are no further questions. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, really informative, and we all learned a lot. So please join me in thanking Naomi for her presentation, and I believe the recording will be made available to the people that registered for this presentation at the end of the presentation in the next short while. Thanks so much, Naomi. You're on mute, Naomi, if you want to say any final words.
Thanks very much, everyone. It's been my privilege to share these stories. It is the Fisherfolk stories and their partners in particular, and there's a lot of great work being done. And I hope that in early 2022, you can have a look at the report that we're producing and the outcomes for that. If you do have any other suggestions or examples, do email me so I can have a look at those. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thanks so much. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.